I think this is what Western Europe is now saying. When it comes to rebuilding Ukraine, it is our companies that are going to rebuild Ukraine. We are the ones that are going to supply arms to Ukraine. So there is also an economic angle to all these, which the Ukrainian administration is incapable of seeing at this stage because they are so preoccupied, they are so consumed with anger, they are so consumed with this misguided belief that membership in NATO or membership in the European Union is going to be the magic wand that will save Ukraine from the Russians.
It's shocking to know that the whole of the Russia-Ukraine war could be avoided. However, it would be against Western companies, especially the arms companies and the United States, as they could not make profits. If Ukraine was not provoked to think it was under threat and should fight the war instead of a dialogue, the Western world could not further its interest. In all that, Ukraine was made a scapegoat that is now understanding how it was trapped. Today, when the world has forgotten what's happening in Ukraine because of a coordinated plan, Professor PLO Lumumba is trying to expose why the Ukraine conflict emerged in the first place. Interestingly, there are hard and bitter lessons for Africa to learn from this conflict, securing it against Western plots and tactics. So, how did PLO Lumumba expose the Ukraine war that the West carefully organized for its benefit? Above all, how is it relevant to Africa? Let's find out.
Was that the world was bipolar. You had at that time the Soviet Union on the other side and the United States on this side with its allies, the Soviet Union on this side with its ally. And if you remember at that time, there were two major military pacts, the NATO alliance and the Warsaw Pact. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, then Americans became dominant, but we are now seeing a world where there are emerging powers. The world is becoming much more multilateral.
Everyone knows that whenever PLO Lumumba speaks, he has something insightful, something which everyone is hiding to say. This time, he has exposed all the reasons behind why the Ukraine war started and is made to last longer. He said that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is one that, unfortunately, could have been avoided. However, no conflict meant no profits for the Western world, especially for the United States. This war must be understood within the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent rise of the Russian Federation. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine held a referendum and became a republic, while the Russian Federation emerged in its current form. In the 1990s, NATO assured former Soviet Union countries, especially those bordering Russia, that they wouldn't pursue membership. This was to maintain neutrality and avoid provoking Russia. Ukraine, along with the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as Finland, were expected to remain neutral, a concept sometimes referred to as Finlandization. The aim was to reassure Russia of its security and prevent military threats. However, recent actions by Ukrainian President Zelensky have deviated from this path. His administration has indicated a desire to distance itself from being a satellite state of Russia. At the same time, the Biden administration in the United States has voiced support for Ukraine's territorial claims, including its ambitions to join NATO and the EU. This stance contradicts previous agreements with Russia. By expediting their NATO application and expressing intentions to join the EU, Ukraine has raised concerns in Russia. According to the NATO treaty, an attack on any member nation is seen as an attack on all members, leading Russia to perceive Ukraine's actions as a threat. This has prompted Russia to initiate what it terms a special operation to address the situation.
Landization. And this was meant to give Russia the comfort that there would be no military threat to you. And successive American heads of states and successive leaders in Ukraine post the collapse of the Soviet Union have behaved in a manner that was consistent with that agreement in order to ensure peace. Comes Zelensky. Then he takes a totally different path. And he takes the path of saying that we are no longer going to be, in his words, a satellite state of Russia.
But who added fuel to the conflict? Well, as expected, Lumumba said that the ongoing conflict is largely fueled by the United States' backing of Zelensky's administration and the European Union's alignment with the same cause. What started as a limited operation has now snowballed into a full-scale proxy war, spearheaded by Western Europe against Russia. Lumumba said that if Ukraine had been left to handle the situation independently, it might have wrapped up within 6 months. However, given the present circumstances, they are deeply entrenched in the conflict, making retreat just as daunting as pushing forward. It should be noted that Lumumba said Ukraine doesn't stand to gain much from this conflict, but it offers immense benefits to the United States. The ongoing involvement of the US and EU in the conflict with Russia is a way to have a testing ground for new weaponry, which mainly serves to project strength. Some observers, including the US Secretary of State, suggest that a significant portion of the aid and donations provided to Ukraine ultimately benefits the United States, primarily through arms purchases.
Is perhaps the best that they gain, and what they do is their military industry also gains. In fact, there are commentators that have said, including the Secretary of State of the United States of America, that whatever donations or whatever support we give to Ukraine, most of it remains in the United States of America because we use it to buy arms.
Honestly, this type of war may not be essential for the United States, as it doesn't yield direct advantages. However, as a military powerhouse, they may view it as a strategic maneuver to contain Russia, keeping them preoccupied and thwarting their ambitions in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But what if there was a different administration in the United States? Lumumba said a different administration in the United States could have paved the way for resolution. Assurances to Russia, such as Ukraine refraining from NATO or EU membership and maintaining neutrality, could have prevented the conflict. As demonstrated by other nations, neutrality could offer Ukraine a viable path forward, given its pivotal role in global grain and fertilizer supply without the need for political allegiance. However, deciding to create adversaries within your own community is completely misguided. It's your own sons, daughters, institutions, and infrastructure that suffer the most. If you look at the demographics of places like Donetsk, Crimea, and Donbass, you will find a diverse population with both Russian and Ukrainian heritage. Lumumba said that these people are essentially family, so why should they be forced into conflict and hostility by individuals thousands of miles away? This is the kind of study that many would have hoped to see from the Kyiv administration. President Erdogan in Turkey, leaders in Belarus, and President Putin in Moscow have all called for this type of reflection. However, the advisors surrounding President Zelensky, from Brussels, London, and Washington, seem to be pushing him to continue the war. In fact, some Western figures have expressed determination to fight until victory. It's almost as if they themselves are directly engaged in a conflict with Russia. However, history has consistently shown that proxy wars ultimately bring suffering to the local population. But how actually the West is benefiting from the war? Well, it is trying to sell the reconstruction narrative. Western Europe is already positioning itself to benefit economically. They say, our companies will take the lead in rebuilding Ukraine, and will supply arms. There's a clear economic aspect to this situation that the Ukrainian administration appears to be overlooking, consumed as they are by anger, and the mistaken belief that NATO or EU membership will automatically shield them from Russia. There's a growing sentiment across the political spectrum in the United States questioning the wisdom of funding this war. Some are asking, why are we involved in yet another conflict? What are we really gaining? Indeed, commentators are drawing comparisons to past conflicts like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, where the costs far outweighed any benefits gained. But what is the future of this war? Well, the war is continuing because the supporters of wars are there. It will end when there will be no supporters. And now, Lumumba said that the support for the war in Ukraine is fading, especially as the US approaches the 2024 elections. Some are increasingly leaning towards backing a Republican candidate, hoping that electing someone like Donald Trump would bring an end to these conflicts. This indicates a decreasing appetite for such military engagements, Members of Congress and the political establishment are questioning the wisdom of spending funds in this manner, recognizing that it's counterproductive and strains relationships with important nations like Russia. Additionally, there's an understanding that sanctions alone aren't enough to weaken Russia, as they have shown resilience and even economic growth despite the pressure. As for Vladimir Putin, he is expected to stay the president of Russia for a longer time, so there will not be any change of plans on the Russian side. The political landscape in the US is complex, but if the current course continues, especially with ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and no major shifts like Donald Trump becoming the Republican nominee, Joe Biden's re-election bid may face hurdles. It wouldn't be surprising if Donald Trump returns to the presidency. His approach to governance is markedly different, prioritizing America first. During his previous term, he pushed for reducing US contributions to NATO and European funding, focusing more on domestic interests. This could result in less funding for leaders like Zelensky and multinational organizations heavily dependent on American support, leading to reduced overall activity. Lumumba said that if a Republican administration led by Donald Trump were to take control of the United States, several of the ongoing wars would likely find resolution. It's important to note that during the tenures of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, there were suggestions, even from insiders in the US, that Russia influenced Trump's elections.
If you remember very keenly, and all of us must remember this, during the administration of Vladimir Putin and that of Donald Trump, there was even a suggestion by insiders in the United States of America that the Russians influenced the elections of Donald Trump. That tells you that there was some kind of rapprochement, some kind of dalliance.
Lumumba said that he expects a quick and significant summit between Trump and Putin if the latter were to win the elections in the United States in November. However, there seems to be a narrative within the Brussels administration aiming to depict Russia as expansionist, suggesting a desire for the Russification of Europe. Yet, Lumumba sees no solid evidence supporting this claim. According to consistent statements from the Russians, they want to live in a neighborhood free from threats, as agreed upon in 1991. Their neighborhood includes Ukraine, the Baltic states, Belarus, Poland, and Hungary. The Russians argue that deploying military forces near this neighborhood contradicts their understanding. Lumumba said that the available evidence does not support the idea that expansion is Russia's primary goal. If it were, many countries in the European Union that were once part of the Russian sphere of influence might not have joined NATO and would be in a Russian-led bloc. But they are not. Lumumba prudently pointed toward a saying that if you want to kill a dog, give it a bad name and then kill it. It seems there's a deliberate effort to tarnish Russia's reputation, similar to the African proverb where a hyena accuses its own of smelling like a goat when it wants to devour one of its kind. But what if Ukraine builds a strong relationship with Russia? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Well, this could lead to prosperity. Lumumba said that if he were advising Ukrainians in navigating this complex situation, he would suggest avoiding alignment with NATO or the European Union. Instead, fostering mutual understanding with Russia would be wise, given the significant Russian population nearby. Trade with both Russia and Europe, stay neutral, and serve as a bridge between Western Europe and what was once referred to as Eastern Europe. This would be the best path for Ukraine. However, Lumumba suspected that, especially under President Zelensky's leadership, Ukraine may pursue NATO and EU membership after the conflict, possibly with Western Europe, led by the United States, expediting the process. Ultimately, the decision lies with Ukraine, but if they choose this path, they risk being stuck in a perpetual conflict with Russia against their own interests. But can this war turn nuclear, and what is there for Africa? Lumumba said earlier discussions often centered on the concept of nuclear armament, emphasizing the principle of mutual assured destruction. The premise was that possessing nuclear capabilities would deter conflict, as the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear war would spare no one. Those in positions of authority should recognize the grave nature of nuclear warfare, where no one would be exempt. Instances of nuclear incidents, like the Chernobyl disaster in the 1980s, the 70s incident in India, and the Fukushima disaster following a Japanese earthquake serve as stark reminders of how even minor accidents can have far-reaching and devastating effects on goods and populations across great distances. A full-scale nuclear conflict would lead to Armageddon, leaving no survivors. While it may seem unlikely that anyone desires such a catastrophic outcome, history has shown that mistakes happen, and there are individuals who may intentionally lead us down that dangerous path, perhaps believing that some could be spared. It's crucial to unequivocally convey that in the event of nuclear warfare, no one would emerge unscathed, and those fortunate enough to survive would endure lives marked by tragedy. Despite possessing nuclear arsenals, efforts have been made to confine the use of nuclear devices solely for peaceful purposes. However, achieving this goal is laden with challenges. The argument for disarmament may seem straightforward, but the complexities of the global economy involving nations like Kenya and others underscore the intricacies at play. Conflicts in various regions of the world resonate throughout the global community, affecting trade and resource distribution. For example, numerous African nations, including Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, depended on imports of grain from Ukraine, fertilizer from Russia, and oil from specific countries. Thus, economic interdependence necessitates a subtle approach to addressing the issues surrounding disarmament. Lumumba said that in times of conflict, nations shoulder the burdens of war. Insurance costs surge as the risks of transporting goods escalate, impacting countries differently based on their reliance on imports. While it's true that wartime often sees a decrease in demand for exported goods, attributing this solely to conflict oversimplifies the situation. It's notable that Ukraine and Russia don't serve as major trading partners for Kenya. Instead, Kenya's primary trade links are with neighboring nations like Uganda and Tanzania. Additionally, the Kenyan currency's tie to the dollar and the influence of IMF and World Bank policies, echoing the structural adjustments of the 1980s, shape our economic conditions. Directives from these entities, such as currency devaluation and tax adjustments, impact the government's fiscal strategies, raising the cost of governance. Put simply, conflict and war in any part of the world affects the entire world. The Ukraine war is directly and indirectly becoming a burden for Africa as well. Although the West should be the cost because it's the party prolonging the war, the ultimate cost is being paid by non-Western countries. So what should Africa do, in Lumumba's opinion? Lumumba said the non-aligned movement emerged in 1961. This movement arose from the perception of a divided world, with the Soviet Union and the United States leading opposing blocs and their allies. During this period, major military alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact held significant influence. The geopolitical landscape underwent significant transformations following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, as the world undergoes significant changes, American dominance is gradually giving way to emerging powers. The global landscape is shifting towards a more diverse structure, with the United States and Europe experiencing a decline in their once unquestionable influence. Lumumba said that new players like the Russians are making their presence felt across different regions, including Latin America, Europe, and Africa. At the same time, political and economic weakness is evident among the Chinese, Indians, and Africans, raising the question of whether Africans should align themselves with any particular side. Lumumba said that instead of urging Africans to take sides, they adopt a moral compass to navigate these complexities. This compass should steer them towards supporting what is morally right, aligning themselves with those who uphold the truth. This approach resonates with the principles of the non-aligned movement, which advocates for positive neutrality. From a diplomatic standpoint, Lumumba refrained from criticizing African nations that actively support Russia in its conflict with Ukraine. Many African countries argue that Russia stood by them during their struggles for independence against various European powers. The Russians provided assistance when African nations faced opposition from the French, English, Portuguese, Dutch, Italians, and Belgians. Institutions like the Friendship University in Russia further solidified these historical bonds. Therefore, supporting Russia does not mean condoning harm to others. Instead, it stems from a sense of solidarity based on shared history and mutual respect. In times of conflict, pretending to be neutral can be misleading, and there are instances where taking a principled stand is necessary. It's important to acknowledge that, even when dealing with adversaries or those not supported, the pain of loss is still deeply felt. So, is it really true that the Ukraine war was deliberately prolonged? Well, the answer is yes. Russia repeatedly offered its hand for negotiation, but either the US made Ukraine not sit for dialogue, or it directly declined the offer. Even just recently, the Biden administration rejected a request from Russian President Vladimir Putin to discuss ending the conflict in Ukraine. This clearly shows that the United States is the key player in the war and is in no mood to end the war. Putin said that we are ready for negotiations and that the current Ukrainian leadership should be advised to stop hostilities and come to the negotiating table. Putin's comments come at a time when he appears to have the upper hand, with the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive failing to make significant progress and the Biden administration struggling to gain congressional approval for much-needed additional military aid to Kyiv. Although Putin has previously signaled a willingness to negotiate Ukraine's future, Western officials have long doubted his sincerity. But the truth is that the West does not want the Ukraine war to end. US and Ukrainian officials suggest that, without increased American aid, Ukraine's military can only maintain its current position in the coming year. However, Biden administration officials maintain that they are not considering pressuring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky into talks with Putin. US officials had previously assessed that Putin had no intention of engaging in serious negotiations until after the November US presidential election. But the question is, how did they judge that without even talking with Putin? Doesn't the Russia-Ukraine war show how the West plays dirty for its own benefit? Do you think that after knowing that the West is often behind all conflicts, Africa should trust it in any engagement? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on how the Russia-Ukraine war can be ended. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.